This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
Hello everyone! Hi, right, thank you. Welcome to another term of the seminar, and good to see you all back. As usual, we have a full term of events. And our summer party has now been changed from the 17th to the 3rd of June, so don't forget to look for that one. And we are going to carry on tonight with Nick Draper from UCL, who's co-director of the Legacies of British Slave Ownership project, which is in a new phase, which is on the structure and significance of the British Caribbean ownership project. So we're going to hear from him on this. And they created this great big database of people who were involved in the slave trade and British slave owners and the compensation they received and the estates they had. So very useful for anybody who's interested in working on this topic. Okay, so if we can go straight into next paper.
All right, thank you very much, Amanda.
Thank you.
And thank you also to the audience. I very much appreciate the opportunity to talk about the Legacy of British Slave Ownership project here tonight. The project, as some of you know, is a collaborative project. I'm only one member of a larger team. It is, by prevailing standards, it is a large team. Catherine Hall, Keith McClellan, myself, 2 postdocs, an administrator. So it's been a well-funded effort, and I'll come back to that later on. And as our name implies, our work is broadly about the imprint of slave ownership on metropolitan Britain. That's the thing that we do. We are, as will become clear to you in the course of this evening, interlopers into the 18th century. And I make that point partly because I've seen what happens to other speakers in this seminar who wander in from the 19th century, believing that they're coming to tell you something that's important to you and the response that they've drawn. So I'm not going to make that mistake, at least. We are clear that we are 19th century historians off our territory, and that has implications I'll come back to. I'm going to talk mainly about the current phase of the project. In order for you to understand that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the first phase, but as Amanda says, this is largely about work in progress. And because it's work in progress, it's not a paper on a single topic or a single case study or a single argument, a single thesis, but a description of wider-ranging work in progress, and I hope you'll bear with me on that. Within that, I'm going to focus on 3 subtopics, which our work is leading us towards. These are 3 of probably dozens, but they're 3 that it's clear to me we will want to use the work that we're doing at the moment, the empirical work, to explore and support, and which are relevant to debates either that are over for the 18th century or perhaps are current or have not yet started or have not yet restarted. One is about the state and slavery, the relationship between the British state and the slave economy. The second is between slavery and the Industrial Revolution. And the third is about the decline of the slave economy in the era of abolitionism. In terms of length, at least, I'm going to put most emphasis on the first of these, the state and slavery, partly because we're at a stage where we actually need most urgently the input from historians who know what they're doing in this period. The work that I'm going to describe to you also, at least in our judgment, raises questions of methodology, questions of ethics, and questions of responsibility and accountability in the public sphere, which are of more general interest, I think, to historians, not 18th century or 19th century historians. They're issues for practitioners of history as a whole. And so I wanted, towards the end, to think or to talk about some of the aspects of those 3 issues, methodology, ethics, and responsibility, obviously interlinked, which the project has given rise to. Some of it we anticipated, some of it we didn't, and there's some learning that we've done. And finally, by way of introduction, and Amanda alluded to this, we hope at least that what we're doing will become a resource for other historians. We're committed to making the data available publicly, and again I'll come back to that, but the data that we have is not manageable by a single set of historians, let alone a single set of 19th century historians playing in the 18th century. So it's important, obviously, that you understand both what the data will be, what its limitations are, but it seems to us, prospectively at least, that the work that we're doing on British slave owners gives one lens, not perhaps a new lens, but a lens through which to view and perhaps revisit some of the big categories of the long 18th century. Ideas of property, ideas of freedom, ideas of the nation and belonging, ideas of race, the nature of the elites, are they open or closed, what's happening with those. And clearly, as I say, we can't pretend to do this all. So we want the data to be available to you in forms that are useful for historians who can make better sense of it. Okay. So with that as a prelude, in order to talk about what we're doing right now in phase 2, I need to summarize for you phase 1. And some of you are familiar with this, but I don't want to presume that everybody is. There's no reason why you should be. So I'm going to be brief, but I hope succinct on this. The first phase of the project ran from 2009 to 2012. What we did was to take the records of the Slave Compensation Commission, and as many of you know, in the 1830s, when Britain abolished slavery, it paid compensation to the slave owners. In itself, interesting, but more interesting to us because that process generated the most extraordinary set of records that are in Kew. It's a single bounded source, and it reflects a complete census of slave owners in the British Empire at the end of slavery. It's a fantastic, wonderful thing to have this material together. It is a moment in time, of course, and it's the end of the story. But those records have supported the initial phases of the project that we've been through. Because, as I say, it gives us complete, comprehensive, I know historians blanch correctly at that as a claim, but it gives us a comprehensive view of slave ownership at the end of the period. It's possible to derive who the people were who owned them, how they came by them, what their locus standi was in these slave compensation records, because in many cases the people who appear as the people who awarded the compensation are not actually the owners, but they're executors, trustees, other forms of financial relationship to slavery. But it's all there in this extraordinary set of data in Kew. The slave compensation process applied to the British Caribbean. It applied to Mauritius and the Cape of Good Hope, and all those records are the ones that were digitized and included in the database that's highlighted behind you. The Act didn't apply explicitly to St. Helena or to what is now Sri Lanka, to Ceylon. It didn't apply implicitly to India because the British state couldn't confront the issue of domestic slavery in India in the way that it could and wanted to chattel slavery in the Caribbean. So, as many of you know, in the 1840s, it simply delegalized slavery in India. It made it impossible to go to court to enforce slave rights. It didn't do anything else in relation to slavery. And the Act also didn't apply to other odd places like Canada, where in fact there were enslaved people in Canada in the 1830s. These records give, in the end, 45,000 people, 45,000 individuals as claimants and awardees of slave compensation. And it's possible, as you recognize today, to do the work in sufficient detail to get some feel for that universe of people. Again, 10, 15, 20 years ago, it would have been impossible to think of on that scale. But we haven't done comprehensive work on all 45,000. What we've done is to winnow out the absentees. In other words, the people who lived in Britain. And again, as you recognize, this category of absentee and resident is a fluid one, of course, we understand that. But we made a decision, correctly I think, to isolate within this universe of slave owners those who lived in Britain, were resident in Britain, and then to look at the legacies that they left in Britain. These legacies, the legacy strands that we're working with and that we've chosen, were commercial, which is a headline for economic, financial, business impact, relationships. Political, what were the slave owners up to politically? You may say that they lost, it doesn't matter. But of course, the terms of emancipation were not a defeat, they were an away draw, I would argue. And in terms of apprenticeship, and then in particular in terms of indentured servitude, indentured labor, the slave owners won. Okay? In the end, they faced down the abolitionists and got consent to change British Guiana and Trinidad in dramatic ways in terms of the population by moving indentured servants to compete with and replace the enslaved people in those territories. So political legacies, culture and philanthropic, self-explanatory. People with money from slavery did a whole range of things with them, including things that we would recognize as being to do with the embedding of themselves in British society through sometimes ostentatious, sometimes less ostentatious, culture and philanthropic activity. So we can see the money flowing into organizations, the Royal National Lifeboat Institution, all kinds of things are funded in part by this money from slavery. The physical legacies, what do people build? what did they buy, but what did they build in particular with money from slavery. What we call imperial legacies. In other words, where else in the empire did these slave owners make an impact? And then historical legacies, which is our phrase or our label for what the slave owners did after emancipation in terms of reworking British ideas of race to reposition emancipation as being a failure, and the failure to be the responsibility of the formerly enslaved people because they wouldn't work. Okay? And many of the slave owners said in the 1830s, the enslaved people are never going to work in states, and in the 1850s they came back and said, guess what? And the abolitionists said, you're right. So there's a significant component within the discourse about race in mid-Victorian Britain, which is to do specifically with slave owners, rewriting their histories, rewriting their family histories, and portraying emancipation as a catastrophe for them economically, but a catastrophe for Britain and for the colonies. We've tracked these legacies forward from the 1830s for this group of people into the later 19th century. And of course the periodization there is blurred, but effectively it's the second and third quarters of the 19th century that we've been interested in. And we've argued a number of things, and this was the subject of the book that we published last year called Legacies of British Slave Ownership. We've argued that the slave owners didn't disappear in the 19th century, they reconfigured themselves. Of course there were spectacular failures, of course there were, but this was an adaptable group of people, and they did indeed adapt to the new world in many different respects. We've tracked the wealth from slavery down the next generations, and with the help of Bill Rubenstein's work, as you know, he's mapped all the dead people dying with personality above £100,000 in Britain in the Victorian period, and we can compare his data set with our data set, and we've done that with him patiently enough on his part. Slave owners accounted for 7 to 10% of the individuals dying between 1809 and 1875 in Britain. And a further 7 to 10% of the dead, largely males, but not exclusively males, in Victorian Britain were in trades that are very closely aligned with slavery, particularly cotton, of course. So we're saying slave owners are 7 to 10%, slave-related industries, Brazil, trade, coffee, cotton, we've used them in kind of fairly indiscriminate buckets, but it's another 7 to 10%. So 15 to 20% of the richest people dying in mid-Victorian Britain, we're talking about after the end of slavery, have money that is demonstrably drawn from the slave economy, and that seemed to us to be a significant finding. We found in addition that slave property was gendered, of course, but that women were disproportionately owners of enslaved people compared to any other form of property that we know. 40% of the slave owners in our database are women. 25% of the absentees, i.e. the slave owners in Britain, are women. So it's a smaller percentage because typically in Britain, men tended to be more active in terms of mediating women's property than they were in the Caribbean. But 40% of the slave owners as a whole are women, and there's no other category of property that we've come across that comes close to that. If you think about rentier stocks, railway stocks and so on, tends to be half that number, if that. So that's a very significant thing. We argue too that the patterns of cultural accumulation, and this follows wealth, continue into the 19th century after the end of emancipation, and you can still see the sons of slave owners in particular are significant cultural figures. The Malcolm collection at the British Museum is from a slave-owning family. That's where his money came from. He took it and he spent it and gave the drawings to old master drawings to the British Museum. No reflection of that, of course, in the British Museum's catalogue. I'll come back to that. We argue that the mercantile slave owners contributed materially to the emergence of the modern British economy. Again, redeploying the wealth that they had from slavery. And again, that's a punchy argument that we'll come back to. And we argued that the West Indians swung towards the white settler colonies in the 1830s. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand are going through critical moments of expansion. And the West Indians, once the fun goes out of slavery, or once slavery ends and the fun goes out of being in the Caribbean, send more and more children off into the white settler colonies. So there's a rebalancing of the empire. As I mentioned to you, we argued that slave owners rewrote the history of abolition and significantly shaped the emergence of harder ideas of race. So in aggregate, when we put this together, what we're claiming in the work from phase one is that you can't understand the 19th century in Britain fully without understanding the continued imprint of colonial slavery even after its abolition. And of course we're not arguing that slavery is the only constitutive thing of the 19th century. Of course we're not doing that. but we are saying that the accumulation of evidence suggests that slavery has a significant afterlife and a significant series of legacies and imprints in Britain in the 19th century. The claims for this, as I said, are in the book that we published last year. The evidence for it is all in the database, so it's there to be kind of publicly pushed around if people choose to do that. It doesn't work quite in the way that you would want the database to work, but it is possible to retrieve the information from it if you choose to do that. And if you can't, tell us and we'll get the information for you in a better form. So that was phase one. Phase two began in January 2013 and is running until the end of this year. The question that we set ourselves for phase two was, how did we get to 1834? In other words, we know the structure and pattern of slave ownership in 1834, but how did that arise over the previous 70 years? And phase two is about tracing backwards the ownership structures that we know were in place in 1834 back into the mid-18th century. We're going back to 1763 for obvious reasons in terms of the ceded islands, the neutral islands that came to Britain after the end of the war against France in 1763, so Grenada, St. Vincent, Dominica, Tobago. These are not blank slates, of course, but there is a very significant deliberate effort by Britain to develop new slave territories on top of the old structures that the French had left in place. In Jamaica, we're going back to 1754 because there's a census that exists in 1754 that is helpful in anchoring it. What we're doing is bounded by the Caribbean, and again, this is important that you understand that limitation. We're not looking at the American colonies. You might say, well, if you violate the Atlantic Anglophone world in this way, then what are you doing? We understand that it's a piece of the puzzle. So logically, there would be a second phase two. It won't be done by us, that will deal with the American colonies. Because, of course, the linkages between the Caribbean, America, and Britain are very important. And again, we understand that. We can't do everything. And equally logically, there should be a phase three, which goes back into the 17th century and looks at slave ownership from the beginning in those territories that were held by Britain in the 17th century. And again, that work may get done. It won't get done by us. We don't have the tools, the equipment, or the background to do it. We're already stretching. And our aim from phase two is to reproduce for, if not the long 18th century, then for the second half of the long 18th century, what we've done in phase one. To trace the estates, therefore develop a picture of the slave owners, single out the absentees among the slave owners, and then develop their legacies in the same methodology, using the same categories, the same legacy strands. So that's the project. So there's significant consistency of broad intent between phases one and two, same people to an extent. And it fits into the same question at the bottom, of course it does, which is what was the importance of empire to Britain? Within that, what was the importance of slavery? And we understand that in focusing on slave ownership, we're only looking at one way in which slavery came back to Britain. And again, we're completely clear on that. It is easy to slip into a view that we're talking about the legacies of slavery. That's not what we're doing. This is legacies of British slave ownership. Slavery came home in many different ways. It came home in commodity flows, in financial impacts. It came home in enslaved African people arriving in Britain in states of unfreedom. So there are many things that happen to bring slavery back home. The absentees, we argue, are one of the key means of transmission, however, of slavery. People living in the UK, living in Britain, who own enslaved people in the Caribbean and draw their wealth from the Caribbean, are one of the prime movers of wealth, but also of ideas, between the Caribbean and Britain. So that's the focus on origins. So there is consistency between phases one and two. There are differences, of course, for us and for observers as well. I've mentioned already one, I don't want to belabor it, but we're 19th century historians. Catherine Hall and Keith McCullough are 19th century historians. And therefore, there is a different challenge in coming back into your territory, if I can put it that way. It's also a move from a synchronic structure of slave ownership, which is crudely what we had, a single point in time, to a diachronic, looking at the changes of the primary unit of organization, the estate, over time. And already we know that whereas we started off with 4,000 estates, we now already have 8,000 estates, because estates, of course, change shape, they change name, they change composition, and therefore, as we go backwards, the universe expands out. It also expands out in the sense that we've moved from one bounded source to a plethora of sources, as you'd recognize. In the early years going back, we've made very heavy use of the slave registers, and I'll come back to this. These are, again, the triennial censuses of the enslaved people that were put in place at the instigation of the abolitionists after the abolition of the slave trade to make sure that actually the slave trade had come to an end. But they're extraordinarily rich sources, both on ownership and on the enslaved people themselves. But once we go prior to 1815, of course, as I said, the sources explode in directions with a velocity that we underestimated. I mean, we knew it would happen, but we hadn't understood fully the implications of that. The difference, the fourth difference between then and now, phase 1, phase 2, is that in phase 2 we made explicit commitments at the outset to addressing at least the issue of incorporating the enslaved people in our work. And that's something, again, that I'll need to come back to. Those are not commitments that I think we're going to deliver on. So as you would infer, we're racing against time to deliver by the end of this year what we'd set out to deliver. In some cases we'll meet our commitments, in others we probably won't. But in the spring of next year, 2016, there'll be another launch of data from this second phase of the project, which in scale will replicate what we already have in place for the 1830s. Because this is work in progress, there are some important things that at this stage I can't answer. Basic questions. Was slave ownership more important to Britain in the 1770s than it was in the 1830s? Right? That seems like a reasonable hypothesis. And what measures do you use to show that? As the work's unfolded, I think that the change in the composition of Britain's slave empire, these colonies that come in 1763, and then the big slab of colonies that come in the early 1800s, Trinidad, British Guiana, in fact at that time Mauritius and Cape of Good Hope, those are significant increments to Britain's slave empire, and I think disrupt what otherwise you would assume would be a steady deterioration or decline in the importance of slavery to Britain. So there's a change in the boundaries. These new colonies generate new men, new money, new legacies, and may offset what would take to be the decline elsewhere. Other basic questions include, does absentee ownership become more important over this period or less important? And again, I can't answer that question. Logically, it should become more important because as each generation goes by, the propensity to transmit it to people who live in Britain should increase. But again, the work is, we haven't reconciled the very high estimates of absenteeism that exist for Jamaica, for example, in the 18th century, to what we know about the position in the 1830s. And there's a disparity there that we need to resolve. And also, we don't know when yet slave property became the preserve of women. As I mentioned, they're very significant in the 1830s. But in the 1760s, for example, Grenada and Tobago, the new land that's being sold is sold to men. Of course it is. I think there's one exception in Tobago where a woman appears to buy land in order to found an estate. So somewhere in the 70-year period, there's a very significant incursion of women into the ownership, and the question is how many generations does it take and what are the mechanics to get to that point. So that's by way of general summary of where we are and what we intend to do. As I said at the outset, there are three areas that I wanted to focus in terms of directions of research that we know we're going to hit. And the first of those I mentioned is the state and slavery. It seems to us that we've done enough work on individuals in the slave system. That's what our phase 1 has been about. We know also, I think we know, that there's been a lot of work thinking about the state in the 18th century. Okay, I'm thinking about June Hoppet and Perry Gorsey in this context. The role of the British state in British economic activity. And what we need to do, it seems to us reasonably clear, what needs to be done, and we're at least as well placed perhaps from the point of view of slave ownership as anybody else, to do it is to try and put these together and think again about what is the relationship between the state and the slave system in the second half of the 18th century and the early part of the 19th century. The British state, of course, is front and center, right? It seizes the slave colonists in the first place. Of course it does by conquest or by war. It makes conscious decisions to take slave colonies from other people or from other powers over time. Once it has them, it organizes and administers the territories. It provides the military and naval protection, of course, on which the colonies depend, both against external and internal threats, including the enslaved people itself. It sets, critically, the regulatory framework in terms of colonial trade, the tariff support that allows, in the end, not very efficient producers of sugar in the Caribbean to continue to dominate and monopolize the UK market. It owned enslaved people itself, and one of the things that we're doing as a sidebar from accumulating knowledge about individual slave owners is beginning to understand the full scope of British state ownership of enslaved people. everywhere. In every colony, there are significant numbers. These are not freed Africans who've been kind of re-employed. These are people being used by the British state in military and naval capacities, sometimes as skilled labour, sometimes as unskilled labour. But the British state is a very active participant in the slave system, slave market, using the enslaved people as labour. But in addition to all these things, it's clear that there's a consistent pattern from 1780 all the way through to the 1830s of financial intervention on behalf of the slave owners. It happens again and again. Whenever there's a problem in the Caribbean, the slave owners turn to the British state, and the British state appears to be responsive. So in 1780, there's the bailing out of a hurricane hits the Caribbean, as obviously is inherent. And for Jamaica and Barbados in 1780, the British state pays money to help those jurisdictions. In the 1790s, in the episode I'm going to talk most about, there's a very material set of loans made to the slave owners after, in particular in Grenada, there is an insurrection, the enslaved people rise up in conjunction with French radicals, and the production system is disrupted. And British merchants persuade the government that the government wants to lend them lots of money to see them through this difficult period. In the early 1830s, again, in the wake of the Baptist War in Jamaica and in the wake of another hurricane, the British state again puts £1 million up to help the planters. None of that, or almost none of that, is ever repaid in the 19th century. So there's a 50-year period of apparent willingness to subvent distressed slave owners over a period of time, when it's clear there are other demands, of course, being made of the government which don't lead to the same thing. And there's been work done on this episode in the 1790s, both by Checkland and more recently by Doug Hamilton in his book about the Caribbean. And both of them treat this as being a kind of reasonably prosaic, well, of course, there was no alternative event. But of course there was an alternative, which was not to do it. And we've been very interested by who got that money and what happened afterwards. Because there were clearly other attempts to raise money from the British state in response to all kinds of things, and generally the British state's response was, well, off you go. But on this occasion, Pitt was reluctant. He actually said no several times to this because he was approached personally, and in the end he was cornered by a combination of Dundas and William Pulteney Johnston for reasons which I'll come back to in a moment. And this is clearly rent-seeking behavior by slave owners. They have a commercial problem and they go to the state and say, you need to fix it. Pitt says, no, that's not what governments do, is it? And they say, well, actually, you need to do this. And so in the mid-1790s, the government lent over £1 million to a collection of 80 or so slave merchants and slave owners. Almost all the slave owners are absentees. Okay? Again, part of the point of being an absentee was to be close to political power and indeed to the sources of finance. The slave merchants, by definition, are almost all metropolitan merchants in Britain. And they receive the money, don't repay it on schedule, of course. It goes on, it gets rolled over and rolled over. And in the end, at least 3 of the loans go into default. The British state steps in and handles itself the liquidation of one of the big mercantile companies in Glasgow, Houston and Co. Instead of letting it go down, they're persuaded that it's too big to fail. And so the British government takes over the responsibility and underwrites the dissolution, the liquidation of that company. Again, it's a very extraordinary financial intervention. Why would they do this? Partly it was out of bad conscience. In 1793, slave owners of Grenada had written to the government, and in the Chatham Papers there's notes from William Curtis, who was a kind of intermediary for them, warning the government to say, there's a problem coming in Grenada. We know that there's a problem between the French and the enslaved people. It's coming. Get ready. We need your help. And nothing was done. And this was the subject of inquiry retrospectively in 1800 and 1801 to look back at why was it that the British government missed the point, missed these warnings. So part of the responsiveness in the mid-1790s is sheepishness, perhaps, about the neglect that they had made of the warnings. The second thing is clearly the nature of the people who were involved in this. Many of the recipients are MPs. Again, you wouldn't be surprised to hear that. It includes Sir John Trevelyan of Nettlecombe, the ancestor, of course, of the great Liberal historians. But it also includes Henry Dundas himself. He's a direct recipient of loans for this purpose. William Pulteney Johnson's brother is in the lists, and so on and so forth. And when loans got stuck, again, William Curtis, I found a note he wrote to Pitt on behalf of a London merchant called John Peter Hankey, saying to Pitt, you have to help him. You have to make sure that this goes through. Hankey had said, go and see Pitt on my behalf, and Curtis wrote to him instead. So there's some old-fashioned, perhaps old corruption here. The systemic risk, I think, again, one wouldn't underestimate. Clearly, in Glasgow, there were some very nervous banks, and the Royal Bank of Scotland and the Bank of Scotland and the Glasgow Chamber of Commerce all write to the government to say, if you let Alexander Houston go down, it's going to be a problem for all of us in Scotland, or in Glasgow in particular. But even acknowledging those three kind of good reasons, it seems to me that this says something about the salience of slavery in the 1790s. And Eric Williams, many of you know his book, Capitalism and Slavery, he kind of banged on in ways that are not attractive to fans of William Pitt about Pitt's shift in the 1790s to being, if not pro-slavery, certainly anti-abolition. The withdrawal of Pitt's support from abolition, because in Williams's formulation, Pitt was concerned about a world war, and he still saw the Caribbean as being a source of power and influence, and he wanted Saint-Domingue for Britain. And as you know, we spent years and tens of thousands of lives and lots of money trying to recover it for slavery. And if it's true that in the 1790s there is a perceived symbiosis between the state and slavery, and there clearly is a perceived symbiosis, then it can't be the case that in 1807 that has dropped away. It just cannot be the case that in 10 years the perspective has shifted in Britain. So it seems to me that these episodes underscore what Williams and David Beck-Ryden more recently have argued, which is 1807, the abolition of the slave trade, is not intended by the state, leaving aside what the abolitionists thought they were doing, is not intended to be a blow against slavery. It's intended to preserve the British slave system in the shape that it then was. Okay? And to prevent it from overexpanding rather than to kill it off. And of course it doesn't kill it off. The slave system continues for 25 years into the 1830s. The second topic that inevitably we're embroiled in is slavery in the Industrial Revolution. It's a chestnut for many of you, and I mean, in some quarters people believe that Eltis and Engelman have dealt it a fatal blow. Trevor Bernard, unbelievably fertile guy, historian, writing another new book, Planters, Merchants and Slaves, which I think is now out, but he very kindly gave it to us in manuscript, talking about a man called Edward Pennant, who lived between the 1670s and the 1730s. And when he died, he owned 8,000 acres and 600 people. That wealth, said Trevor, eventually descended to his grandson Richard Pennant, who used his Jamaican wealth and a marriage to a Welsh heiress to establish large slate works in North Wales. This is the Penrhyn story. His Jamaican plantation underwrote that industrial expansion in about the only example where the Williams thesis of plantation money underwriting British industrialization is correct. So a significant statement from Trevor about that part of the Williams thesis. Now, of course, as some of you recognize, this is a caricature of Williams's position. Williams wasn't truly confining himself to saying that the profits from slavery and the slave trade were one of the streams of capital in the Industrial Revolution. He did say that, but he also argued for the systemic effects of slavery on the demand for manufactures, on lower cost raw materials, on the development of new industries and transforming those materials. He argued for conspicuous consumption as being an economic driver and a factor, and again, probably all of us would recognize that in terms of the long 18th century. And he argued critically, too, for the institutional impact of slavery and the slave trade on credit and financial networks in Britain. And again, recent work, Pat Hansen, for example, mainstream economic historians appear to me, at least, to be coming back towards that component, at least of the Williams thesis. But in this wider discussion, we've got two contributions to make. One is just to verify, as a factual matter, Trevor Bernard's comment about the Jamaican planters. And I suspect that he's right. If you think about the big Jamaican planter families, the Dawkins, the Pennants, most of them come back to Britain with an explicitly rentier program. That's what they want to do. They want to come back. They want to spend the money buying land. They do. And they're not very interested in directly mobilizing their capital for other uses, industrial uses in particular. So I think that we need to document that. But these Jamaicans are not active capitalists. They're rentiers. I think we can accept that. You may still think that there's some significance to their rentier capital. Simon Taylor, very famously, always described as the richest commoner in the British Empire. There were many richest commoners in the British Empire, it turns out, in the 18th and 19th century. It's a phrase that comes up again and again. But nevertheless, a very, very wealthy man from slavery. He dies in 1813. He left his money, he left his estates in Jamaica, but he left money, and it was in the funds. Of course it was in the funds. It was a lifestyle, life cycle thing, and he had invested in the national debt, because that's sensible from his point of view, and that's what he did. And we see slave owner after slave owner who has this form of capital. So one of the kind of undone things is to look systematically at, in fact, the proportion of the new national debt that's being issued in this period that the slave owners are accounting for. And if we can come close to that, it would be worth doing. But apart from Jamaica, elsewhere, in the Ceded Islands in particular, but then in British Guiana in turn, the men, and it is men, who are driving the train in terms of the expansion of the slave empire are a different breed. They are entrepreneurial, they're mercantile, and they're very mobile in the way they use their capital. And it's in this nexus that we think that we will find and demonstrate the continued transfer of wealth from slavery into British industrial investment. And Tom Devine's already done this to an extent for Glasgow and the cotton trade around Glasgow, showing that a significant proportion of that capital is rooted through Glaswegian merchants who were involved, particularly in St. Vincent and Grenada, and then in turn in British Guiana. In the way, the argument is not, did Britain need the capital from the slave owners? I think it's probably accepted that there was plenty of capital around, but the fact is that Britain did use the capital from slave ownership because it was in the right place at the right time to be deployed and redeployed. So again, we need to demonstrate and document that. And finally, and relatively briefly, the third very kind of intensive intervention in what has historically been also a very bad-tempered discussion is about the decline of the slave economy. And everybody agrees that after 1807, there's a decline in the slave economy. In our first phase book, we qualified that to say whatever ideological or conceptual underpinning you put around decline as a category, we can see wealth from slavery being generated and redeployed into Britain in the course of the 19th century. So it may be less than at a previous point, it may be less than some optimal number, but nevertheless, that process is going on. So it's not as though the system is bankrupt, which is what one would take away perhaps from the conventional wisdom. And one of the things we can do, because we're aggregating the data, is to look, for example, at wills and the level of annuities that owners put on their properties over time. So we've got time sequences. Of course, we understand that the annuities reflect expectations. They may not get paid over an entire lifetime, but some of that we can catch in the 1830s because as part of the compensation process, there are lots, by which I mean probably low hundreds, of dependents stepping forward to say, where's my annuity? It hasn't been paid for years, but now I want the slave compensation. So there's some control over what happens to the annuities, and we will have enough data, I think, to be able to look meaningfully at trends over time for estates of the same magnitude. In the late 18th century, slave owners are putting £2,000 or £3,000 per year as annuities for their wife, in most cases, and then additional annuities for daughters and sometimes for sons. By the 1810s and 1820s, that number is dropping in most things, and we can chart that decline, I think, over time. What will be displayed, I think, for issues number 2 and number 3 is the highly uneven nature of the slave economy. Jamaica dominates the historiography of slavery. It dominated the view in Britain of slavery even at the time, and it certainly does today. And Jamaica is only 40% of the British slave empire. What's happening elsewhere is at least as important as Jamaica. So the Jamaican story is a straightforward one, I think, that fits in many respects with Williams's decline thesis. That isn't the case elsewhere. Okay, just moving towards, at least we're past halfway. There are the 3 issues that I wanted to talk about that were more generally perhaps of interest or relevant to historians as a whole. One is the issue of methodology, and as you would have inferred by now, well and truly, our method is or has been prosopographic. Okay, what we're doing is generating thousands of micro-histories. They're sketches, actually. They're not even micro-histories. They're not even case studies. There's thousands of sketches of elite men and women. That's what we're doing in Britain. And then from that, we're claiming to write totalizing history. Economic, social, political, cultural, we're saying we're doing it all. So obviously, from your point of view and any reasonable point of view, there's at least a twofold challenge. How do you move from the evidence to the conclusions that you have? What are the gaps between your evidence and your argument? And then how do you avoid vertical gaps between the types of legacy that you're discussing, the types of history that you're doing? And we don't claim that we've solved either problem. I mean, we need to be clear about the limits of what we can say. But one of the merits of what we're doing is this accumulation of case studies and evidence means that we can contextualize almost anybody. Is John Gladstone typical as a Liverpudlian merchant in that he's invested in lots of different things around the world? Well, we know now the answer to that question is yes, actually he's not unique. He's a representative of a larger group of very significant merchants in Liverpool. Is William Beckford unique in kind of cultural conspicuous consumption that ends in tears? No, we know also that that's the case. So contextualizing is important, and we can count, and most of our work is not statistically sophisticated in any way. We're just counting numbers of people and comparing them to other universes. Hence this thing with Bill Rubenstein about 15 to 20%, and hence the other shorthand, which is that between 5 and 10% of the British elites, however you measure the elites, are in the slave compensation records. And again, the wealth is only one subset of that. As we've gone through, we've begun to conclude, I think, that the unit that we've used, the individual, is not the right or the only unit. In the second phase, the unit is the estate. That's what we're using as the key driver, tracking the ownership of estates rather than tracking the people per se. We then track the people as a secondary. But in both cases, in fact, the unit of analysis actually is or should be the family. That's inevitably where we are, because we're looking across generations and because we're looking across geographies. The family, both inside families and outside families, are absolutely critical to this story of the transmission of slave property. And again, we're aggregating hundreds of individual cases of how white male slave owners treated their outside children, their natural children, in the colonies. And again, out of that we can form some kind of systematic appraisal of what was going on in those relationships, each of which, of course, is individually specific. And the family, of course, is an imperial form, as people have recognized too for a long time. And we had, with Margot Finn, we did some work a couple of years ago on families who had common roots in the West and the East Indies. And again, although you might think of these as being largely separate spheres, of course, there are families who consciously have kind of managed their risk by sending off male offshoots, and then in many cases female offshoots as well, into these different jurisdictions over time. And there is, in addition to that diversification, we think, as slavery comes to an end, there is a reorientation more heavily towards the East Indies, away from the West Indies. So people are calling time, even before slavery is ended. In the 1830s, as I said, they go to the white settler colonies. In the 1790s through to the 1820s, there seems to be a greater movement towards directing the next generation towards the East Indies rather than the West Indies. Okay, two other issues. One is ethics. And there are two components to this. One is the basic issue. We're devoting a lot of resources to recovering the history of the enslavers. A lot of resources by any normal standards. Those are resources not available to those who want to recover the histories of the enslaved. And we understand that. We understand why we're doing the work. We think the work is important, and it's the work we can do. That's our contribution. But it remains the case that the histories of the enslaved people are truly lost. And there are audiences, of course there are, who are highly critical of that decision, our participation in that privileging of the enslaved, the privileging of the enslaver over the enslaved people, because that's inherent in our project. That's indeed what we're doing. Privileging them in terms of the effort to recover their stories. We said at the outset, and I mentioned this to you this evening at the outset, that we had committed that we would do a better job of reflecting the enslaved people in the second phase. And that I don't think we're going to deliver on in a way that would be satisfactory, at least to us. I'm not sure our standards are necessarily the highest, so For other people, that may be a miss by a mile. We've been in a long negotiation with Ancestry.com, which is, as you may know, the commercial genealogical site, to try to integrate their material. They have the slave registers. They're not allowed to charge for them, but they have digitized in a catastrophic way the slave registers. We're trying to provide the linkage to our work so that people who are interested in the enslaved people at least can go straight from our material into the slave registers or vice versa. It sounds like a simple thing to do, but of course it's much more complicated, partly because of the nature of the ownership of the data. So that's one thing that we had committed to do, which we may or may not bring about in the next year or so. And we're accumulating material piecemeal about the enslaved. And it supports, of course, fantastic case studies, but that's what it is. And we haven't come close to aggregating material on the enslaved. It's just been beyond this. The second component of the ethics, and it shades into responsibility and accountability, I think, is about naming and shaming. Inherent, of course, in our database are the ancestors of people who are alive today. And we have, in the past, been tempted and sometimes fallen to the temptation of making those links and connecting people together. One of them is the Hailsham family. There have been two Viscount Hailshams, Tory party chancellors, Lord Chancellors in Britain, one in the 1930s, one in the under both Heath and Thatcher. Their middle name was McGarrell. Charles McGarrell is a slave owner in British Guiana in the 1810s, 1820s. Very late in life, he marries a much younger woman and adopts his brother-in-law as a protege, Quintin Hogg. Quintin Hogg obviously founds, in the end, what's become the University of Westminster, but he also founds the dynasty of the McGarrells. Douglas Hogg, the MP and former minister, whose duck house we all paid for, is a lineal descendant. And we've tended to be a bit frivolous about those linkages. It's not up to us to draw them. But the data is there, and of course other people have got access to it and can make those connections. We made a mistake. I made a mistake. This was not the rest of the team. Early on, with the Financial Times, focusing on Freshfields and Rothschild because it seemed like a kind of an important thing to do. But with Rothschild, it was a very bad mistake because it fed into the whole issue of Jews and the slave trade, which is a very, very charged issue, and it was irresponsible to use the compensation records to say, guess what, we've found N.M. Rothschild in the slave compensation records. They are there, the bank is there, Nathan Meyer Rothschild himself is there, it's a single claim in Antigua, and it doesn't in any way reflect the nature of Rothschild's business. So that was a bad mistake, which, as I say, we won't or haven't repeated. And the other aspect of responsibility and accountability is towards the reparations movement in the Caribbean. As some of you know, CARICOM, representing the Anglophone Caribbean plus Haiti, have gone into a public campaign to oblige the British, French and Dutch state to engage in the question of reparations payments to the Caribbean. This has been a movement that's ebbed and flowed. In the US in the 1990s, early 2000s, there was a relatively lively discussion. It's now completely dead in the States. It just seems to have passed away. There are still people working for it, but its resonance appears to have dropped away. CARICOM has picked up the baton, and our work is obviously relevant to that discussion. But in what way is it relevant, and what should we do? We said at the outset that we would not take a position on reparations, and we've adhered to that. Friends in the Caribbean, friends of the project in the Caribbean have grown very frustrated with that and said that isn't right. You can't keep your fingers out of the ringer any longer. Either you're with us or you're against us. And that's the point we're at now in relation to at least some members of the reparations movement in the Caribbean. So I don't want to end on a note of complaint as though this were kind of all too difficult. Of course, it's an absolute privilege to work on the material that we've got. It's a privilege to be funded as we have been over the last, it will be 6 years. And it's a privilege to work on material that has got some reach beyond the academy. And again, I mean, probably the closest analogy I can think of is probably the old Bailey Sessions, to make available material to people who have got an enormous appetite for historical material and can use it in ways that we can't. And particularly the local dimensions of what we have means that in every town or village or certainly city, every county in Britain, it's possible to use our database and generate a number of slave owners who are local. And that ability then to take those local cases and connect the locality to the global system of slavery is a very powerful thing in terms of public history. And we've tried to find as many ways as we can to maximize the take-up and the use of that, which is a terrific thing from our point of view. With schools, again, potentially this is an extraordinary resource, but it has to be handmade for each school, and that's a limitation. The two postdocs on the project, Kate Donington and Christy Warren, did a project with Hackney Museum, which was a wonderful project looking with school children at local history, abolitionists, the history of slavery, bringing it together, and creating a teacher's pack for teachers in Hackney, because it's very locally specific. That can be reproduced, but only with labour, across all the London boroughs, and eventually it could be reproduced nationally if we had the resources. So there's an appetite out there, and we can get most reach ourselves from this, not by doing it ourselves, but if we can put the material in the hands of historians, like perhaps some of you, who know what they're doing and can use that to deploy it both academically but also outside the academy, which is part of the picture from our point of view at least. But you need to know what's coming. Early in 2016, as I say, we're going to release another chunk of data in the same form as the existing database. It's being developed underneath the existing database at the moment. And we hope then that at least some of you will engage with that material, engage with us, and take from it what you can and what you need to both reflect possibly on old issues from your point of view in the light of new evidence, but also perhaps to connect with a wider public around this material. Thank you very much.